Right. For this next session, I'm very pleased to be joined by William Walker, Commercial Solutions Manager at Brook Green Supply. Um, I'm going to do a little intro, William, as I promised. William joined Brook Green Supply in 2024 as a commercial energy analyst, developing expertise in industrial energy and customer supply solutions. He's now Commercial Solutions Manager, where he plays a key role in shaping the company's industrial customer proposition, especially in the EV sector, and his work includes structuring flexible energy solutions for charge point operators and large fleet customers, supporting cost-effective electrification and decarbonization. William, thank you for joining us. That was
Thank you for
quite a
having
long
me.
intro, I realize.
No, it's all good.
Obviously, much of today's agenda is looking at EV charging from the infrastructure side, so chargers, sites, connections, reliability, customer experience, all of that. But obviously, your perspective is slightly different because Brook Green Supply works with EV and fleet operators from the energy supply side.
Yes.
Um, so obviously we're going to be looking at what happens behind the charger, which includes tariffs, non-commodity costs, utilization, flexibility, risk, and policy. We've got quite a lot to cover, and just around half an hour to do it. So let's start. Could you briefly introduce Brook Green Supply and explain where you sit in the energy market?
Sure. Yeah, I guess a bit of an overview. Brook Green Supply, we've been around for about 10 years now. We only operate in the non-domestic sector. So I think a lot of people potentially on the call maybe haven't heard of us. So we don't operate in the domestic. But what we've done over the last 10 years is grow the business really well. And we typically targeted large consuming industrial and commercial users, and that's enabled us to specialize our offering. So in engaging with large consumers, we can then, provide them really, really bespoke supply arrangements. I think over the last few years, we had a look at sectors that were interesting to us and where we thought there was going to be growth and areas that we wanted to focus on. And EV definitely stood out as one of those. So we've been
Mm.
working with a number of different EV models from logistics, as you said, fleets, also public charging too. And I think that's given us a really broad understanding of a lot of the players and stakeholders in the sector, but also has really, really highlighted a lot of the, concurrent issues that stem across
Mm.
the sector as a whole.
And you sort of touched on what my first question is going to be, because I always like to start from a high level and then like go really far in. But
Sure.
what do you see, what are you seeing across the charging market that perhaps does not get the attention it deserves? Some of those issues that you sort of touched on there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think energy is such a current topic, if you will, in the market at the moment, where we're seeing obviously the U.S. invasion of Iran and the conflict going on there. So I think energies, people are a lot more clued in. I think also off the back
Mm.
of the Russia-Ukraine conflict too, people started looking at their energy tariffs a lot more than perhaps we used to maybe 5, 6 years ago. And on the energy side, yes, the cost is going up, but also the cost of operating, managing the grid is going up too. And so I think it's also important to look at the underlying mechanics behind that, and understanding, ways that we can improve that and ways that we can sort of reduce the mystic, why is my energy bill going up, sort of narrative as well. Definitely.
I mean, the cost of energy is in today's news already.
Of
In
course.
terms of, we've announced that how do I phrase this? We're loosening the sanctions on Russia to just bring those energy costs down because, the Iranian conflict is sort of still playing quite a role here in the UK. And I think that's going to start in the EV charging sense. It's going to start, we're going to go from where there's a real clamor to install as many chargers as possible, but now it's looking at how do we operate those chargers commercially using the energy costs, the high energy costs that we have. Like, how do you think that's going?
I think it's difficult. I think a lot of the appeal for electrifying was almost disconnecting from, the price of diesel, the price of oil. But now in the UK, where gas is, leading the marginal cost of
Mm.
the grid, it's very hard to escape those costs. Now that we're connected to global geopolitics, where we're having to import a lot of our
Yes.
gas because we can't just flow it through Russia. Yeah, we're suddenly connected to what's going on the other side of the world, what's going on in Australia, what's going on in the Middle East. So I think it's been a bit of a stunt to the progress, perhaps, of electrification. The pence per kilowatt hour rate continues to rise for a lot of businesses, and that can be quite frustrating, I think, when there was definitely appeal that hopefully with more renewables on the grid that cost would come down.
Yeah, unfortunately, I know the government has announced that it wants to unlink electricity costs from gas prices because it has been there for a long, long time. But we're still obviously in the early stages. I want to bring it just back down this funnel, back to electrical EV charging. Sorry, my voice is going this morning.
That's right.
So let's talk about charging models. So far this morning, we've been using the term EV charging as a
Sure.
fairly broad phrase, but in reality, there is obviously more nuance to that. Um, Obviously, you have fast charging, rapid and ultra rapid charging, depot charging, fleet charging, and other models as well. And each of those obviously have a very different energy proposition. From a supplier's perspective, how different are those charging models?
As I said earlier, I think there's a lot of similarities between, but fundamentally they are hugely different. In terms of
Mm,
the operating these sites, in terms of, as you mentioned, some of the slower charging, you may have, more, you see that more typically in the public charging sort of sector, where you've got smaller chargers that perhaps are more in remote areas or distributed across cities, whereas then you have some of the largest hubs for huge logistics outfits, huge fleet operators, the likes of bus companies as well, operating
mm,
electrifying in places like London and Manchester and Glasgow. So yeah, fundamentally so different. And I think whilst, attaining a grid capacity is an issue that probably, sits the same with
all of
both.
them. Yeah.
I think in terms of how those businesses operate and what they can also give back to the grid, is uniquely different. So I think that's something we really, really try to take time on and understanding, each business's nuance as well. I also think from perhaps the perspective of fleet operators, they're used to running
Mm,
these fleets. Yes, they're changing and electrifying, but they're used to managing and operating these businesses. And so it's almost about adapting and evolving. Whereas for charge point
yeah.
operators, it's an sort of mapped market. You're going in somewhere that's new, and if you're not just piggybacking off typical demand centers, so hubs, the likes of petrol stations, etc., and you're trying to do
Yeah.
distributed charging in urban areas or rural areas, I think there's really, really unique challenges that we're only, still discovering now. So I think it's quite a challenging space to be expanding in.
You sort of touched on it there, in terms of what are the charging models that are going to be easiest to forecast and which are more
Yes.
volatile. Do you want to go into a bit more detail
Yeah,
there?
definitely. I think as much as we like to think we're not, humans are relatively predictable. As a supplier, we tend to see that when we're looking at, seasonal trends and how that operates over the grid. I think public charging is perhaps where that slightly unravels. I think in some of the higher demand areas, as I said earlier, you do sort of see that, people coming in, charging their vehicles in the morning, perhaps going to work, and then, disconnecting those at the end of the day. Whereas on the fleet model, that's super predictable. If you've got bus timetables and charging schedules that they know the vehicle is out in the morning and back at this time, you can really hone in on that focused charging schedule. Similar with
Yeah.
logistics as well. You maybe know where your vehicles are if you're tracking those. Perhaps you're going between nodes, between your hubs and your warehouses. Perhaps that's a bit easier to map. Whereas in the public
Yeah.
charging sector, we see utilization become such a big problem. Where in rural areas you've got some meters that are broken and there's no visibility of that, or people are only using it infrequently, but you still need to expand so you can help cover these people and they're not stranded with a charge point, the nearest one being 50 miles away. So yeah, I think human behavior is definitely a really interesting part of the EV uptake, both in freight distribution, but also in the sort of driver experience in the domestic sector too.
I guess they can sort of, in terms of the charge point operators, just to hone in on that point. Obviously, they can predict kind of when they might get an influx. Because I always notice that on Christmas Day, quite a few of the charge point operators are like, you can charge for free because no one's going to really be traveling on that day. Whereas obviously on other days where, peak holiday periods, potentially they'll be able to forecast a bit better. But
Yeah,
obviously the
definitely.
volatility is still there.
Yeah, definitely. I
Um,
think it's
yeah,
sorry, just on that, I think,
yeah.
signaling super important. As you sort of touched on there, it's about connecting with the customer and sort of giving them the right signals that this is a good time to charge on the grid, or this is a good time to come and plug your car in, and giving those monetary incentives to get users in, and using the sites when it makes sense.
And we're actually going to talk about a bit of the monetary side of things in terms of tariffs, because obviously, as an energy provider, tariffs
Yes.
are your bread and butter. So let's talk about them. Obviously, for EV charging operators and fleet customers, what would you say a good energy tariff needs to actually reflect?
Sure. I think probably as a good starting point, just for the benefit of the people on the call, is probably worth breaking down what your energy cost actually is made up of. So it almost has two components. So there's the commodity cost, which is the actual bit of the energy on the grid that you're buying. And then the other part, which is the non-commodity costs, which is all the fees that enable the grid to run smoothly, and also to fund the build out of the transmission and distribution networks. The non-commodity elements, the non-energy part of your bill, has been rising significantly. And now, on average, makes up 60% of your bill. For a lot of EV operators, that can be closer to 70% or 80% of their bill. So it's really important to understand, the makeup of your bill and how that's being managed. I think for different businesses, so perhaps in some of the logistics spaces, as I said before, in terms of energy spend, their transport units maybe don't make up as large of a portion of their entire business model. So I think you can be a bit more experimental with these sites. Can develop new products and develop new solutions, and like I said, experiment with these sort of pilot depots and really, really learn and understand how it works for your business. Whereas in the public charging space, this is the entire business model. You need to get
Mm.
a sound charging setup. So I think risk management is super important for them, taking quite a risk averse view so that you can scale your business and sort of build more charges and get more deployment out there. And hopefully the uptake then sort of comes along as cost comes down. I think similarly for bus operators, they're quite a unique setup where they've almost
Yeah.
contracted for a number of years to run a certain route. So they've got an obligation to a customer and they can't just put the prices up if the cost of energy goes up. So again, they need to be super risk averse. And I think, taking a commercial view at managing their energy contract because they're huge demand centers now. As electrification increases, it's making up such a large part of our energy mix on the electricity side. So
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely think risk management is consistent across both. And I think, like I said earlier, that's quite current at the moment where we're seeing rising costs on the energy portion due to geopolitical conflict.
I break down like some of the things you said there into smaller chunks.
Sure.
Firstly, why are non-commodity costs becoming so important in the UK energy market right now?
So I think the UK's done a great job of decarbonizing the grid. As we're installing
Mm.
more renewables, it's been really, really good to see. And you sort of drive down coastal routes and you see a lot of wind turbines, and that's become more and more frequent over the last few years as we push to sort of net zero as 2030. I think the challenge with that on the opposite side is that you need to build out a grid that can support that.
Yeah.
So building the cables that can connect both the upstream and the downstream, so the generation to the customers that it needs to get to. I think we're very fortunate in the UK that we have a lot of wind, but a lot of that resides up in Scotland, up in the north, and a lot of the demand resides in the south. So it's how do you get it from A to B? And the cost of balancing that and transporting that is really, really expensive. So the issue
Yeah.
there is that, as I mentioned, those non-energy costs go up and up and up, even though it seems that the actual energy portion, bar geopolitical events, does seem to be decreasing as we're, putting more renewables on the grid that have lower operating costs. So I think that's been, something that we could perhaps review as a sort of country.
Yeah.
But yeah, making sure customers understand that those costs are increasing, why they're increasing, gives them visibility on areas that they can improve. Some of those costs are based on when they consume on the grid. So, you
Yeah.
have your sort of red band, which operates sort of, 5 to 7 in your peak areas. So being able to avoid simple tranches like that can reduce costs considerably for businesses.
So, and what do you think operators should understand about the difference between, commodity and non-commodity costs?
Definitely, I think it's understanding which, where are those peak price points and what's hitting your business. I think
Yeah.
if you can charge overnight and you're naturally going to avoid, like I said, some of those time of use elements. But a lot of those costs, so as I mentioned on the transmission and distribution, so the fees for getting energy from A to B, those are charged on a pence per day or a pound per day rate. So no
Mm.
matter how much you're consuming, you're still going to see those costs. So I think it's about understanding, ways that you can either reduce your import capacity at your site so that you're not facing these fees, or yeah, being a bit more selective in where you put those, where you electrify some of your sites, because that will vary across the country as well.
I guess it's easier for someone like a depot to sort of charge at night, but a public charge point operator, obviously, they're going to have most of their peak demand at those peak periods, before work, after work, during travel
Precisely.
periods. So they sort of can't have the same
No, they
sort of
can't.
control.
No, definitely. And I think, again, it's something I mentioned before about signaling, can you suggest people to consume elsewhere during the day? But I think in if you can reduce the entire business spend and cost, you can then reduce those costs even in the peak periods. You can almost sort of spread that through your customer base. I also think there's a lot of additional ways of reducing those costs by almost creating revenue and giving back
Mm.
to the grid. I think one of the great things about electrified transport is that it's distributed flexibility. Everybody on the
Yeah.
grid can partake, and vehicles can be almost utilized to act as batteries and distributed flexibility. So I think charge point operators can get paid for doing that, and that can help them bring down the costs of their customers, and they can use that to offset some of those peak costs that they see on the grid as well.
I know we're going to get back to that
Yes.
a bit later, and just putting a pin in that, and remembering to get back to that. But also, do you think sometimes people become too focused on the headline price per pence kilowatt hour number without looking at actually the full drawbacks of the tariff, or potentially the benefits of the tariff? Green tariffs potentially could be good for a company's image.
100%. I think if we're electrifying transport, it needs to be sustainable at the end of the day. I don't see much point in, sort of, yeah, not bolting that on as an add-on. And the cost of that has come down considerably over the last few years in the sort of renewable certificate market, which is really, really positive. Um, but yeah, I think it's important that cost is managed because yeah, risk management is super super important when we're seeing geopolitical events like we are at the moment. Customers need to be forward thinking about this and sort of seeing how their
Yeah,
demand is going to change over time. As I've sort of highlighted on before, transport sector is growing significantly and scaling. So it's important about looking at not what your business is doing now, but what it's going to be doing in 2, 3 years' time and having that real forward view and forecasting that both in terms of your energy demand, but then in terms of managing that cost and looking into sort of forward and future markets where energy costs might be a bit cheaper and future-proofing that a
yeah.
little bit more.
Yeah, and obviously, earlier you spoke about how there's the wider electrification landscape, because obviously you mentioned we're trying to electrify transport, heat, industry, while also decarbonizing supply and building out the grid. So how do you think that wider picture will change the cost environment for EV charging, is especially?
So there was a change to how energy was calculated in terms of the retrieval of these network costs a couple of years ago, which was called the targeted charge review. And this was
Mm,
super significant for EV customers because historically, the cost to build out the network on the grid was done based on how much you used in a year. That cost
yeah,
then changed to instead of being how much you consume in a year, the measure became what you could consume in a day. So for a lot of these EV sites, both in the public charging and in the fleet sort of space and logistics, they've overprocured capacity because you're trying to future-proof your business. You need the high capacities in order to, um, yeah, get the high-speed charging that you need to be able to charge these vehicles at scale. The issue with that is that when the site's not being used, you're not getting the benefit and you're still paying for that capacity. So that's both, an issue on the public charging sector where you typically don't see much utilization overnight, but then also
yeah,
in, the sort of fleet sector where, typically vehicles are meant to be out on the road, they're meant to be, doing their job. So when they're charging overnight, they're not being used in the day. The issue is those costs continue to increase as well. So I mentioned earlier about those pound per day figures. Those have gone up close to 300 to 400%
mm,
over the last 5 or 6 years. And we can see those continue to increase all the way out to 2030. So yes, whilst we're electrifying on the grid and, the likes of heat pumps and electrified transport is a really, really beneficial thing for the country. As we're increasing the demand whilst also trying to decarbonize the supply, it's, two moving parts here and they don't seem to marry up at the moment. So yes, EV has definitely been a loser of this change in policy. And I think, that's definitely been quite frustrating for a lot of our customers that have been privy to this change over the last few years.
and you sort of touched on utilization there, as like a major focus. What happens when a charging site has high fixed costs but low or uncertain utilization? Like what's the outcome of that?
Sure. I mean, as I said, historically, the costs were typically levied and charged based on how much you use in a year. But I think if the EV uptake has definitely been a bit slower in terms of, the public cars. But the consequence of that is that, you need to have the capacity for the future. As he
Mm,
just highlighted in the previous call, getting capacity on the grid is so, so difficult.
yeah,
And so you want to get it when you can and get it installed and get your sites live, but you're then paying for that from day one, and it's not proportional to the customer usage there. So we're trying to future-proof the grid and get the grid to a point where it's ready to, sort of take on this EV transition. But at the moment, people are still paying for the sites, way over perhaps what would be proportionally relevant for these businesses. So utilization is super, super important. And I think that's probably the defining characteristic of why EV, both in the fleet space, but also in the public charging space, has definitely struggled in terms of cost and why the cost of operating these sites has increased as well.
yeah, and obviously we could talk about a lot of these problems all day long, because obviously we're seeing some charging operators that have obviously fallen by the wayside, or we've seen consolidation in the market. And do you think this is sort of a response to the situation that we're in now with higher energy costs, but also the difficulty of getting grid connections? What's your views there?
Definitely. I think so. We've worked with a lot of charge point operators, some of them in their infancy, so sort of circa
Mm.
7 years ago. And I think what we've learned with those businesses is that it was, as I said earlier, such an unmapped market. They were entering in something that was super unknown and they were trying to be a sort of pioneer in the space. And I think the difficulty of that is often when you're an early mover, other businesses will come in post that and perhaps do it slightly better and learn from those mistakes. So I think that's been really difficult. And as you said, yes, a few businesses have sort of fallen, and there's definitely been a bit of consolidation in that space too. I think the benefit of that is though that we can learn from these mistakes, and I think it's important to absorb the knowledge gained there and yeah, adapt it in terms of business design and as we scale those models. I think perhaps it was more of a speculative investment, sort of a green technology, whereas now it seems like a much more established technology as we're electrifying a lot more on the grid. So I
Mm.
think, you can look at some of the recent investments in some of the larger charge point operators as well. A lot of that money is coming from government. So large investment funds like the National Wealth Fund are investing in EV. And so there's a lot of belief in government from that, which I think drives investor confidence. So I think we're almost at a bit of a turning point now where some of those charge point operators, they're seeing a bit more of a future there. But I still think it's a very, very difficult market to operate in at the moment as well.
But obviously, consolidation can actually be one of the solutions for dealing with combating some of these costs, because obviously, if you can spread it over a much wider network, then you can have ones that carry others.
Yes.
What are other practical options that EV charge point operators and even fleet operators can do to combat these costs?
As I sort of mentioned earlier a little bit, it's about solutions. So, like you sort of mentioned in my intro, I work on our solutions team as a supplier, and we really, really try to connect solutions with supply when it comes to customers that are in the EV space, because I think there's a lot of really exciting things you can do with an EV site, both in the public charging sector, but also in the depot space as well. As I mentioned, these are large, large demand centers. As their volume's increasing, transport's going to become one of the largest components of our electricity demand in the country. But also, what that means is that it's a large demand center that can be flexible. For a lot of these logistics sites and fleet operators, they can move this demand around and, avoid non-commodity costs, but also then give back to the grid and shift when demand is low and when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, and you can try and consume energy when it is. So I think there's a really exciting opportunity there, and it's about connecting customers with that, but also making sure that the meter points are kitted out so that they're able to respond to these, positive signals on the grid. Similarly, in the public charging space as well, I think, yeah, you being able to provide customers with incentives to charge off peak is super important. And then, in building that flexibility and supporting the grid, actually EV can give back a lot. Yes, it's adding a bit of a burden by taking up a lot of the capacity that, is quite scarce on the grid. But at the same time, it has the ability to then, yeah, give back almost as a distributed battery service as well.
You've brought us right back to flexibility. So let's talk about flexibility a bit more.
Sure.
Obviously, it's likely to become a much bigger component of EV charging in the future. We've seen like really cool ideas proposed. I think UK Power Networks proposed using like long stay car parks at airports like Heathrow for balancing the wider grid, which obviously great idea. Hundreds of cars that just sit there idle, doing nothing. So why not have them do something? Um, do you think flexibility is mainly a revenue opportunity, or is it a cost avoidance tool, or a way of actually reducing pressure on the grid?
I think first and foremost, it should be a means of reducing pressure on the grid. I think that's probably the largest
Hmm.
issue that we have. As I mentioned, we're largely wind dominated, so it's incredibly volatile in terms of our generation. And then with solar on top of that too. So I think EV can then pair with that very nicely, as you said there, where you've got cars that are sat idle but still connected to the grid to charge selectively, or if there's export capability to then be pushing energy back into the grid as well. So I think that should be the first sort of focus. I think with that, then almost generates value. Understanding, what EV vehicles can provide back to the grid is then very easy to almost put price points on that and provide signals. So I think there's been a lot of new exciting markets in the ancillary services space that have opened up, and there's definitely compatibility for EV customers to step into those markets and almost, yeah, monetize that flexibility, which ultimately, should bring down consumer costs on the other side as well.
And what do you think needs to be in place before an EV load can actually become genuinely useful as part of flexibility?
Sure. I think part of the benefit of some of the new markets is you don't need export capability, but I also think that, working with local DNO operators, and in building out export capability will, increase the value of these sites as well. I think especially when you've got very large connections and high capacities where you're doing high speed charging. I think there's a case there where they're slightly larger setups and they've got more significant substations to then have export capability flowing through those as well. I think completely changes the business model, which should put a lot of the value back into the customer hands on that side as well.
Yeah. I just want to jump because I realized that we've raced through this, but there's not a lot of time.
Sure.
So I just want to jump to like managing risk. It's obviously a really important thing. And we spoke about how, there's consolidation in this market, and obviously that can be part of managing risk by ensuring that you have that bigger network. But obviously, as your charging portfolio scales, energy demand also becomes a larger commercial risk. So how do you manage that risk?
Sure. So I guess as a supplier, rather than sort of stepping into typical day and night tariff rates, we give a lot of that power back to the customer. So we allow them to buy on future wholesale markets, and they can, like I said, almost, yeah, lock in some of that energy cost in as you would trade almost diesel, historically as well for a lot of these fleet operators. So there's a lot of parallels in terms of the procurement strategy there. And we work very closely with fleet operators, but also sustainability and finance teams in managing that cost over time. Because yeah, I think it's super important to take that forward view on energy where it's a lot cheaper looking down the curve. But
Mm.
at the moment, when we have a lot of volatility, as I said, with geopolitical events, often that cost can increase significantly at short notice. I think we're up about 60% where we were relative to a year ago, looking at the winter 26 market. So yeah, by locking in that cost ahead of time, businesses are able to take a lot more control on their energy. And I think, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, people are much more engaged on energy contracts. I think people have been reading a lot on the news and taking a genuine interest in it. I think that's something we've seen across EV space, both in fleet operators and charge point operators. So it's really positive to see. And I definitely encourage, yeah, businesses to reach out and engage with their supplier on more flexible ways of buying their energy. Because, yeah,
And I guess having more data from all of your sites and improving your forecasting, even AI could
completely.
help with all of this to help manage that risk.
Definitely. We're in the midst of a significant change in energy at the moment, which is market-wide half-hourly settlement. So
Mm.
all of these meters that were typically not metered on a half-hourly basis are being switched to half-hourly. So that's both going to give the operators on the grid a lot more visibility of a lot of these charge points, and how they're consuming, which should also reduce their cost. But also it gives businesses the opportunity to enter more granular markets, where yeah, the grid has better visibility of how they're consuming and then how they can reduce costs around that.
Excellent. And I know we have just 3 minutes, so I want to
Cool.
end by looking up at policy.
Yes.
Do you think energy policy is actually keeping pace with the electrification of transport?
I think it's difficult. I think where government has pushed for net zero, it's created quite difficult constraints on the grid in terms of actually matching that in terms of an ambition and a target. I still think we should be pushing for renewable build out on the grid, but I think it's
Mm.
important that it's safeguarding the sectors that we think are important. And I do believe that EV transport has been slightly left behind in that. But as also mentioned on the previous call with Eddie, there's been some really, really good bits of work from the Department of Transport and from Ofgem as well. So we're working very closely with them on collating data. As you mentioned, data is so, so important, both
Mm.
showing how consumption is changing and how these sites are operating, but then also in terms of cost and how that's changing on the grid and really, really putting that out transparently so that we can make better informed decisions that hopefully safeguard EVs and consider them slightly better in terms of policy moving forward.
And in terms of policy, do you think the current market rules are actually designed for the kind of large, flexible electricity demand that EV charging will create going forward?
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned it earlier on this call about the targeted charge review. So the change in
Yeah.
methodology from annual consumption to almost looking at the maximum you can draw from the grid. And EV was 100% one of the losers of that, unfortunately. So I think recognizing that is probably the first thing, but then also reviewing that policy potentially, or maybe implementing other policies that better cater for EV to ensure that they're supported. Because fundamentally, we want to decarbonize transport. It's super important, and I think that's why everyone is on this call because they're looking to do that. So yeah, I think it's important that policy safeguards EV, but also supports it and creates incentives there to decarbonize fleets and charge points.
Amazing. William, thank you. I want to close by summarizing some of the themes. Obviously, we've covered and leave the audience with a clear takeaway. Whether someone is looking to charging a fleet or operating public charge points, what would you say are the key factors that will determine success over the next 5 years, especially in the current climate? I know that's hard considering the
Right.
current climate changes as the wind changes, but take a stab.
I'd say be brave. Open up, conversations with your supplier, talk to them about your energy contract and sort of make more decisions there. You have a lot of autonomy as a fleet operator. So I think, yeah, recognizing that value, be more flexible in terms of your business consumption, and yeah, the cost should come down in time.
Amazing. And you brought us right on time. So, William, thank you very much for that conversation. Really appreciate you joining us today. And yeah,
Thank
and
you for having me.
hopefully people have come away with a better understanding.
Thanks, Jordan.